Welcome to the Unfiltered Show from the Score Studios. My name is Joseph Casciaro, and today our guest is unquestionably one of the best and funniest follows on basketball Twitter. He co-hosts the You Know Ball podcast. He goes by Trill Bro Dude on Twitter, but we just call him Trill. Trill, what's going on, man? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's X, by the way, now. I'm not sure if you heard the news, but we don't call it Twitter.
Yeah. Hopefully Elon's not watching this, so there'll be no cease and desist letters to the Unfiltered Show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be on, talk about my favorite thing, Sixers ownership.
Yeah. Nothing says content like stadium renderings and relocation plans. We're obviously going to get into a lot with you today, a lot of Sixers talk. Obviously, one of the more exciting teams to kind of ramp up and think about as the season gets closer with the Paul George edition and them having championship expectations, Joel Embiid, all that. We're going to get into all that. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the other news and notes going on around the league. But before we get into all that, we have you on. We're going to talk Sixers. I have to ask you because, for us sitting here in Toronto and for the average NBA fan, they might not really know or understand what's going on. But all this talk about relocation when it comes to the Sixers and potentially moving to New Jersey. I want to get your thoughts on it as a Philly guy, as a Sixers fan, as someone who covers the team. First of all, I want to know, how serious do you think this is? How real do you think this, I don't know if I want to call it a threat, but how real do you think this threat of relocation is?
I do think part of it is definitely for leverage in negotiations while they're trying to basically put a stadium directly in the middle of our center city, which will cause a ton of issues with public transportation, with a lot of people that live in that area, which is the Chinatown in Philadelphia, are just opposed to the Sixers kind of coming in and taking over that entire neighborhood. And I think part of it is at least that, but this is something that has been in the works for probably since they bought the team over a decade ago. Josh Harris and Blitzer, they actually have their practice facility set up in New Jersey. New Jersey has been pushing for this for a while. They've been offering them tax breaks and all these things so they can revitalize the waterfront in Camden, which it does sound kind of insane to someone that isn't familiar with Philadelphia that a team could be in New Jersey. But it's like when you think about like the Jets and the Giants and how they're in it, we're much closer to Camden. Like I'm currently sitting in my place in South Philly, which is 10 minutes from the stadium, and I'm 15 minutes from Camden. So it's not like it's like, they're moving it to the middle of New Jersey. It would potentially be right up on that waterfront, but I do think it is a real threat. I think part of the thing is that the Sixers ownership group is always going to do what's the best business decision for them. And they've always kind of been at opposition with the city since they moved here. They're New York guys, they're capital guys, and they don't particularly care about, what the fans want and what the city wants. They're just in it for a business opportunity. So I do think it is a real threat. Now, if I had to say today, I'd probably say 70-30 that it stays in Philadelphia, just because I do think that they're already not in great standing with the city when you consider how much, they've invested in this team, and there's just been second round exit after second round exit until this first round exit. So the team not performing as well is also a factor in this. I think the ownership group doesn't have the highest approval rating as it is. And I think that it's something that we could see over the course of, the next year really play out. And I hope they don't get their way. I want it to stay in the city. We have a great setup here. All the sports teams play in the same area. Everyone loves it. So it would really just suck to take away that from the fans.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, because my next question to you is going to be, how big of a deal would it actually be, given, some of the things you mentioned, like the practice facilities already there in Camden. It's a 10 or 15-minute drive from where the Sixers currently play at Wells Fargo Center to where the new arena would be. I think I was reading, you mentioned that kind of the people in the neighborhood didn't necessarily want the arena going where they're proposing for it to go in Philly. I was reading one newspaper article about how apparently 69% of Philly residents polled don't want an arena in the Stadium Center. So when you put all that together and then consider that the new stadium would actually only be 10 to 15 minutes away, is this actually a big deal? Like, do people in Philly care about it that much? Or
I think
are they distraught by the idea that this could be the New Jersey 7? Would they even call it the new? No, it would still be the Philadelphia 76ers, right?
Yeah. Because Camden is just a stone's throw away. It's literally right across the Ben Franklin Bridge. Like, you could see Camden from Philly. You could see Philly from Camden. Where there are concerts over there, there's a lot of stuff that you can do just, right over the bridge. But my whole thing about it is that I think that Philly people really don't like. There are two things they don't like. They don't like change, and they don't like people that come down from New York and tell them what to do. So it's kind of the fact that my whole life, like, I'm in my mid 30s, and my whole life we have had the stadium set up as it is: Eagles, Phillies, Flyers, Sixers, all in one spot. So I think even beyond, you're talking about like them not wanting to move the team to Center City, where they're proposing it now, and they're negotiating with the city on potentially moving it there. They also don't want it in Camden. They just want it to stay the same. They want everything to be, either Sixers and Flyers share the same stadium like they have been for my whole life, or they could potentially build out in a larger space down near the current stadiums as it is, because there is a lot of area down there. So like I said, I think it's more about the fact that people just don't like change here. And it has been the same setup. Public transportation, you can take the subway directly to the stadiums. It's, there a massive amount of parking down there. It's already set up so perfectly that everyone's like, why would you change it? And I think that is the big factor. And then the New Jersey thing is just another, wrinkle into this whole thing, where people really would not like the fact that they could potentially take it out of state just to save money, just to, save money on taxes and all that. So once again, I think it's more about the fact that people just kind of want to keep it the same as it has always been.
Yeah, I think that's understandable. All right. The one thing I think Sixers fans don't want to stay the same is the performance of the Philadelphia 76ers on the court. And obviously acquiring Paul George this summer goes a long way towards ensuring that doesn't happen, or at least I think so. From your vantage point, with you kind of having your finger on the pulse of fans and the team, what do you think is a realistic expectation for this team this season? Obviously, we know they are a championship contender, but what's a realistic expectation for how this season ends in Philly?
We've been having this conversation, me and you, for like 3 straight years now. Yeah. Every time that I talk to you about this, it feels like all we want is that conference finals. All we want is just to break through and be in that Final Four. And, after they trade for James Harden and, Tyrese Maxey makes a leap and Joel's an MVP candidate, and they can just, no matter what happens, no matter who the coach is, no matter who the surrounding cast is, it seems like it always just ends the same. This year, obviously, I talked about it was the first round exit. It's normally a second round exit. And I think we are past the point. I have a friend who said this many times to me. I think we're past the point of a feel-good Eastern Conference Finals appearance. Because if this happened, in 2019, if this happened in 2021, sure, your Joel's still in his 20s. The team hasn't had all of these failures add up time and time again, these disappointing exits. I think now it's really like finals appearance or bust for the Sixers in the next 2 to 3 years, because this is the realistic window. Like, Joel is now 30. Paul George, you just signed him to this massive contract in his mid-30s. And while I think he will be still a valuable contributor on this team, he's not going to be playing at this level until he's 40 years old. He's already showed some signs of decline. And while I think because of his size and his shooting touch, I think that he'll age pretty gracefully, you're really looking at this team with, a championship level head coach, in theory, should be a championship level best player, a rising star in Tyrese, Paul George, and then a good amount of depth. I wouldn't say that they're like the most stacked team, but they still have assets. They have picks and contracts to make another move happen at some point during this season. So they can use the first few months of the season to identify really what they need to do to take this team up from, a contender to a legit team that can win the actual NBA finals this upcoming season. So like I said, I think it's finals or bust the next 2 to 3 years. They got to make it at least once and give themselves a puncher's chance to, really win this thing, or else they'll view this whole window as a disappointment.
Yeah, I agree. I think the window is these next couple of years. Embiid's got the player option for the third season, but yeah, he's essentially expiring in 2026 if you're talking about guaranteed money. He's 30 years old. Paul George, 34 years old, I believe expires in 2027. Maxey, obviously the youngest at 23, doesn't expire until 2029. But you really got these next 2 seasons where you got all 3 guaranteed under team control, and probably all 3 still somewhat in their prime. Even Paul George, I know, he's 34. But if you just think about even what he was last season, an extremely efficient 22, 5, and 3 or 22, 5, and 4 guy. I think he actually became just the 8th player ever to average 22 plus points on that level of efficiency, where he was 50% or better from 2-point range, 40% or better from 3-point range, and 90% or better from the free throw line. So, Paul George, still an elite scorer, elite offensive player, elite shooter. I think the fact that he will be more of the tertiary option on this team actually will help him age really gracefully and kind of ease into his later years. I think it's the perfect setup for him. I think the way he fits in as, a guy that, like I said, you look at his numbers and the production and the efficiency. He played 74 games last year, too, the most he's played in a long time. I think he can be, on the nights the Sixers need him to be, whether it's because Embiid's out of the lineup or for whatever reason, he can still, on a night-to-night basis, take on a primary role. And then over the course of the whole season can be that number 3 guy, number 2 guy. I just think he's in the perfect spot. I think he balances out the Embiid and Maxey dynamic so perfectly. We've talked about this for a while now. I thought he was just the perfect missing piece for this team. I believe in the Sixers more than I have pretty much at any point in the Embiid era, probably since that Jimmy Butler year. I think everything is set up really well. The one concern I would have, and again, I know that I'm not breaking any news to you because we've had these conversations for years, but, we've talked a lot about Joel Embiid's struggles or inconsistencies or durability issues in the playoffs. Is there any concern in your mind about the fact that Paul George's playoff track record isn't exactly sparkling either? Do you believe there's actually something there where it's between PG and Joel Embiid, they're not playoff performers in a way, and you have to account for that in your expectations? Or you think that's all small sample size stuff and it's no, they're great players, and if they're healthy and they're all on the court, this team's going to rock and roll?
I think that there is something to it. I think you would be lying to yourself if you didn't say, because if you think about the Paul George playoff track record, now obviously early in his career, he overperforms when he's on those Pacers team as a young player. And then, a little bit shaky with his record with OKC. And then you look at his history with the Clippers and you go, okay, the only year that he really performed above was kind of that year where the stadiums weren't really full. It was during kind of a half COVID year in 2021 when he carried the team without Kawhi Leonard to the Western Conference Finals. I do think that there is something to that with not just Paul George. I think Joel Embiid as well. We've talked about it. I think what Wolfon has said about this is perfect. It's yes, the injuries probably hurt his level of play when he gets to the playoffs because he's hurt every single year, but it also doesn't matter because he is hurt every single year. And that's just something that you kind of have to bake into the equation. I don't think it's something you can completely dismiss, because we just saw him probably coming off one of his better playoff series against a real opponent in the Knicks series, where he had a 50-point game. He had a 40-point game in the closeout, but also, mobility-wise, he wasn't quite the same defensively. He literally couldn't even jump. They were just killing him with that little mid-range game and the little pop and floater to Hartenstein in that series. And to me, the only thing that matters this upcoming season is Joel's health. And I think that they have addressed some of that, going out and getting Andre Drummond, drafting a Dembona in the second round, and then also on top of that, potentially maybe trying to find some small ball lineups with Gershon Yabusele, who they signed after his great run at the Olympics. So I'm hoping that this regular season is about keeping Joel healthy, because I do believe the moments are there. The consistency is really not what has been there from Joel in the playoffs. And while the injuries might factor in, they are the biggest part of this whole thing. And if you can't keep him and PG healthy, it's a really tough needle to thread. PG also hasn't been the most healthy. You just mentioned that he played 74 games last year. It was a contract year. Guys play up in contract years. I'm hoping that, the fact that these awards are now you have to play a certain amount of games, it means that I don't want Joel to necessarily push it, but it's always been really hard for him, and I'm sure Paul George as well, where if you only play in the 50s or like even low 60s as an NBA player,
And
it's hard to
just
stay in shape.
and by the way, Embiid, I've looked it up this morning. So even in the 8 seasons he's actually played, like take away the first 2 years where he did not play at all. In the
Yeah.
8 seasons he's actually played, he averages 54 games per season.
Right. And this past season was actually a little bit of an outlier. I think it was the first time that he's missed more than 2 straight weeks since his rookie season, I believe, which, look, all things considered, I think that it's going to be one of those things where they're going to have to be careful with his minutes, careful with his workload. Hopefully you can spread some of that out to the rest of the team. They have more shot creation than they ever have before. They have more guys that can run offense. Maybe try to make it so that Joel isn't having to have the highest usage in the NBA throughout the whole season so that you don't run into the same thing that you ran into last year. And then really it's just about that last month. Can you keep him healthy? Can you keep him in shape? Because that's the thing that people don't really talk about with Joel. It's like, it's not like people do talk about the fact that he can't stay in shape, but it's almost always directly related to the injuries. Like if he is injured and he cannot play, there's no way to really, especially because a lot of these injuries for him have been lower body injuries. There's no way for him to stay in shape while he's out of the lineup. So like I said, I think this year should be more about focusing on keeping Joel and PG as healthy as possible throughout the regular season. Don't care about seeding. Like we've learned that these teams like the Miami Heat and the Dallas Mavericks, like now look, did they win the NBA Finals? No, but they've made it as the 4 seed, the 8 seed, the 5 seed. Like I think to give yourself a chance against a team like the Celtics in the East or against a team, whoever comes out of the West, whether it's the Nuggets or the Thunder or whoever, you got to really worry about keeping Joel and PG healthy first and foremost. And, even if you're the 5 seed, I think you just got to be able to live with whatever the results are when you get to the playoffs.
Yep. And again, I think the presence of PG and then being together with Maxey there as well, I think that's going to help both guys stay healthy and fresher because Embiid does not have to carry. He still can, but he does not have to carry the usage and the volume and the offensive responsibility he's had to the last few years. And even from Paul George's perspective, like I said, he's like the number 3 guy. And I think that's the perfect kind of place for him at this point in his career. I think those guys will help each other balance out their health and freshness getting to the playoffs. And if all 3 of those guys are healthy and on the court, I'm well aware of the playoff track record of both PG and Embiid. Like I said, I've laughed about Embiid's playoff track record plenty of times over the years. We had his elimination game numbers up earlier. It's ugly. But at a certain point, the talent has to come through. And those 3 guys on the court, healthy together in the playoffs, they've got a shot to win. Real quick before we move on to the next topic, you talked about the seeding and how they don't necessarily have to worry about where they fall, just going to get to the playoffs healthy. Where do you see the Sixers stacking up in the East, whether we're talking seeding or even in playoff rankings? Because I've got them number 2 behind Boston, and I think that's actually become a somewhat unpopular opinion. I know talking to a lot of people still have the Knicks slightly ahead of them. Some of them still have Milwaukee slightly ahead of them. I've got them number 2. Where do you have them?
I think the more that I think about this, the more I think about how availability is just so important nowadays in terms of it's impossible for me to say now who I think will be the best when it comes playoff time. But just if we're just saying across the board and we're assuming, every team is healthy, I think I would also put them second. I'd probably put Boston first. I think I'd have them in a tier with Knicks. Like I think that it's a little bit interchangeable, just because like the Knicks beat them in a playoff series last year. And while I think this team is much better, replace Tobias Harris with Paul George, have the ability to potentially upgrade, adding in Yabusele and Caleb Martin and guys that, especially Caleb, someone who's proven himself in the playoffs before, adding in those guys. And then also potentially, I think it's going to be, I think they're going to be super aggressive at the deadline to upgrade this roster. Like, I don't think that they're going to be happy with just looking at this team and saying like Daryl Morey has so many times before and just kind of sat on his hands at the deadline and maybe made one move. Like, I think they'll be aggressive in pursuing a Bogdanovich or someone that might fit that 4 role that they're really desperately looking for, someone who could shoot, rebound, and defend. Not easy to find. But in general, I think right now, as we're looking at it, I think the Sixers have that top end talent. I think the depth is good enough. I think they have the ability to make those upgrades. The Knicks, to me, are such a weird matchup for the Sixers because they're a small team, but they rebound so well. And that's always throughout the whole Joel Embiid era. We actually recently rewatched that game 7 of Sixers Raptors on a live stream. And even during that, when they had Jimmy Butler and Ben Simmons and these guys that are good positional rebounders, they just couldn't rebound. And that is something that I think will always be a thorn in their side when they play specifically against Boston and specifically against the Knicks. And I think the fact that the Knicks are a bad matchup potentially for the Sixers doesn't mean, like, I think if we're just looking at the Sixers like playing against every team in the East, I feel pretty confident about them. It's the Knicks and the Celtics are the two teams that I really think that they have to prove themselves against. And I would take them against pretty much anyone else in the East right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then the one thing the Sixers have going for them, too, in comparison to other teams that are as talented as them, other teams that think they have a big three, is that the Sixers still have that flexibility that you alluded to, whereas a lot of those other teams with the same level of talent are either already second apron teams or they're pushing right up against it and don't really have maneuverability. Whereas the Sixers, because of the advantages that came with Tyrese Maxey being the player he was still on his rookie scale contract, then signing the extension, they were able to bring Paul George in without bumping up against that second apron yet. And they still have some assets left. Like, they're in a really good spot where, unlike a lot of the other teams squarely in the championship conversation, they actually can still make some moves. And I think that is a very big advantage in this cap environment.
Definitely. I mean, they have, like, even without touching the rotation, you can almost get to like $16 million in tradable salary, plus about 4 first-round picks, extra swaps. If Jared McCain is a young player on this team, if he shows anything in his rookie season, he could be someone that they potentially move at this deadline to make more veteran upgrades, maybe to a rebuilding team. And once again, I still think that this team's biggest need is going to be that 4 spot. I think Yabusele, I think he'll be a fine bench for. I think he'll be a guy that can come in and do the things that they need: rebound, score, shoot the ball. But I also still think that that's like the major missing piece. Like we saw with Miami a few years ago when they put Caleb Martin at the 4, it doesn't really work when you go up against the best teams in the NBA. And I am a little bit concerned about potentially, teams that really just rebound them to death. And, we went from being a bad rebounding team last year to, not really addressing that at all this offseason. So I think that's something that they really need to pursue at this upcoming deadline.
Moving on a little bit, you mentioned rewatching Game 7 of Raptors Sixers, and I think if we both rewatched it, I think it's a bit of a happier rewatch for me than it is for you. I'd be sitting there drinking your tears. But that Game 7 is that game specifically, maybe not in the news, but that series and that Raptors playoff run was talked about a little more than usual this past week in NBA news circles because DeMar DeRozan, in an interview, mentioned that he thinks that even without the Raptors trading him for Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green as well, that even if he had stayed in Toronto, he's got no doubt the Raptors still would have won a championship. Now, I don't think he specified in 2019, but in general, he mentioned that they would still win a championship. Now, look, I'm not going to hate on DeMar for saying that. We know that in general, professional athletes lack a certain sense of self-awareness because how could you not when you get to the heights they've gotten to? I'm not going to hate him for having that self-belief and that confidence. But I can tell you from sitting here in Toronto, the Raptors were not winning a championship without making that trade. They were not winning a championship with DeMar DeRozan, despite how great he is. I was just mentioning on the show last week, DeMar DeRozan has a Hall of Fame case. It's not necessarily a knock on him. It's just there are levels to this. And Kawhi Leonard is of a different level, as everyone in Toronto and San Antonio and even LA knows. From your vantage point, as a Sixers fan who had to watch that beautiful, beautiful series that ended in just such perfect fashion, do you believe the Sixers still lose that series if you replace Kawhi Leonard, and I guess Danny Green as well, with DeMar DeRozan?
Absolutely not. I mean, Kawhi was so important throughout this because everyone remembers Game 7 when, honestly, it wasn't the most efficient game from him. It wasn't the best game of the series or the playoff run from him, but he made the big shot at the end that obviously won. The thing that people forget about that series is Game 4. Kyle Lowry even talks about it to this day.
Yes.
Where Game 4, it's in Philly. The Sixers are winning that game, about to go up 3-1. Kyle Lowry's looking around thinking it's over. this thing didn't work out with Kawhi. Obviously he's a free agent after what are we going to do? And then Kawhi just absolutely nails down the stretch of that game, hits 3 huge shots to keep the Raptors in the series, then ends up obviously winning it for them in game 7 with a heroic shot at the end of the series. Not only was the fact that, he had to play hero ball so many times in that series for you guys, but there's also the fact that, like, adding Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard made you guys such an unstoppable defensive team. Like, that team was just like, it's crazy to think about the defensive talent on that team now. And OG Anunoby didn't even play.
Yep. His appendix burst, I believe, right before the playoffs. Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't even play. And now you look at the Pascal Siakam, Marc Gasol, Kyle Lowry, like, that team, their only defensive weak point really was Norm Powell. And Norm Powell didn't even play in that game 7 that we rewatched. So he played, like, I think spot minutes. So not only like the strength of that Raptors team was not only Kawhi bailing them out time and time again, and then you also had the ability of Pascal and Lowry to scale up at times, and then obviously Fred VanVleet carrying them down the stretch of that run. But the defense was just so unstoppably good. The rebounding was so incredible, and that's the thing about a guy like Kawhi that I feel like does get a little bit overlooked. He's not only doing what a better version of what DeMar could do on offense, he's also then contributing on the defensive end and making that team just like a dominant two-way force and bailing them out so many times in the Sixers series, in the Bucks series, and then the rest of the team was able to carry them over the finish line against the Warriors in the final. So yeah, love DeMar DeRozan. Like, he seems like a great guy, but there's just no way in the world he would have ever been able to do what Kawhi does. No. Like you said, there's levels to this.
Yeah, no, they would have been a second round out again. Like, even if they had still made the trade for Gasol, so he still neutralizes Joel Embiid. We know Gasol was Embiid's kryptonite, but the problem with having DeMar instead of Kawhi is Kawhi Leonard was the best player on the floor in basically every series the Raptors played in that championship run. And he was never better than he was in that Philly series. Like, game 4 in particular, the one you mentioned, I wrote about it at the time, how that was the game, and the way the Raptors won that game on the road to even that series was the game where it felt like, oh, okay, this team actually has it. And this is the difference between having a guy and not having a guy. And Kawhi Leonard's a guy. And that's what, like, they go down 3-1 in the series if it's not for Kawhi, if DeMar's there. Like, they lose in the second round, forget winning a championship. And that's the difference there, right? Like, Kawhi was the best player in every series. If DeMar's replacing Kawhi, even if Joel Embiid's neutralized, then Jimmy Butler's probably the best player in that series, and you're not winning. People forget, not only did that series come down to a 4-bounce buzzer beater, I believe the point differential, the cumulative point differential, point totals for that series were like right around even, or like separated by a point or two. Like, that series was as dead even as series get. And if you replace Kawhi Leonard with DeMar DeRozan, it's going the other way. And forget championships, the Raptors are losing in the second round. Sorry, DeMar, but you're wrong on
it would have looked a lot like that next season when they pushed the Celtics to 7.
Exactly.
But they just didn't have enough juice to get over the finish line.
Yeah, exactly. All right, last bit of news I wanted to get your perspective on. So the Miami Heat announced that they are giving Dwayne Wade a statue, unveiling it on October 27th, which I believe is the 21st anniversary of his NBA debut. There are a lot of legends, Hall of Famers that are recently retired, recently inducted, but still don't have statues, maybe never will. I want your take on, after Wade, who is the next retired player to get a statue, and where will it be?
Mike Muscala, Philadelphia 76ers. Right outside the facility, we have, we had Dr. J, we got Iverson. Just add Muscala to the mix. For anyone who doesn't know the lore here, Mike Muscala.
Yes, please explain the story. Yeah.
Famously hit a shot in the bubble against the Miami Heat that seemed like meaningless at the time. Was not to me, because I knew that the Sixers owned the OKC, when he played for OKC at the time, their top 20 protected pick. And that pick took them from pick 20 to pick 21. Pick 21, of course, becomes Tyrese Maxey, one of the best players from that draft. And essentially, we're not even having this conversation if that doesn't happen. Because Joel Embiid's probably not on the Sixers anymore. This window's probably already closed. It probably looks similar to what that DeMar Lowry thing, without the Kawhi trade on the other side. So Muscala essentially pried open the Sixers' chances here by giving us an all-star, a young all-star, drop right into our lap in Tyrese Maxey. But yeah, obviously that's like a huge thing for Sixers fans. We love to talk about the Muscala thing all the time. He just retired.
Would Mike Muscala get a real full-size statue, or would he get the little garden gnome-size statues that are all outside, that line the Sixers practice facility that everyone was laughing about when AI's was unveiled?
Yeah, he can get a bobblehead just right outside. Like that's basically the size of those. Yeah, I don't know why we don't have full like life-size statues. We actually do of Doug Peterson and Nick Foles from the Super Bowl. So I don't know why the Sixers have decided to go with the miniature
because they're just waiting to unveil the Muscala one.
Yeah, he'll be the first person to get the shot over Tyler Hero. But yeah, no, just a very poetic, but a serious answer for that. How come Tim Duncan doesn't have a statue in San Antonio? I talked about this with a friend last night when you sent me this, and we were talking about how weird it is that none of the Spurs players have really gotten that kind of recognition from, in my lifetime, if not the best dynasty, the obviously I don't remember the Chicago Bulls. So in my opinion, 5 championships, multiple MVPs, finals MVPs, just making this team relevant for 20 years. And to then not even get a statue at the facility or in the city of San Antonio in general. Why? Not that Tim Duncan would care. Let's be honest. Tim Duncan's not the kind of guy that would care about this. But I think the organization should, at a minimum, recognize him and give him a statue. I don't understand why they haven't yet.
Yeah, I don't know if the Admiral has. Like, I don't think, or I could be wrong. I don't think David Robinson has one either. Like you said, they kind of haven't done it for any of those guys. Obviously, if they haven't done it for the Twin Towers, they haven't done it for Manu and Tony either. Like, I don't know if it has something to do with, like, the whole Spurs way and like that no player is actually bigger than the culture and the team. But even that, I mean, obviously we know how BS that is when you're talking about superstars. And even that doesn't fly when you consider that Greg Popovich has joked about the fact that basically every single time he sits down to a nice meal or toasts with a really nice glass of wine, he literally says thanks Tim or thanks Timmy or something, because he acknowledges that he would have none of that and the Spurs would have nothing if it wasn't for Tim Duncan. So I'm with you. Give the guy a statue. I'm going to stay close to home, and people in Toronto maybe rolling their eyes, people not in Toronto also rolling their eyes. I think it's Vince Carter. And I don't think it's necessarily that in Toronto. And I don't think it's necessarily that I'm saying he is the most deserving of the guys who don't have one, because if that was the case, I'm with you. It's Timmy or even maybe David Robinson. But I think when you consider who I think is next, he's about to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. The Raptors are about to celebrate their 30th season in franchise history. The hatchet has been buried when it comes to Vince Carter and Toronto, Vince Carter and the fans. It's a love fest for the most part again now. He's grown. He's had the Hall of Fame career. He's had Raptors fans have grown. They've got a championship. Like, everything's different now. And I think people, even the people that hated the way he exited the most, and understandably so, have, I think, for the most part, come to grips with the fact that there was that element of him putting the team on the map, him bringing a type of exposure and relevance to the franchise that was never there before. And also, in Canada, we talk about the Vince Carter effect and how his popularity and the way he single-handedly at the time grew the game of basketball in Toronto and in Canada led to the wave, or at least, partly led to the wave. I don't want to take away from guys like Steve Nash either, but, Vince had a huge part in kind of beginning that tidal wave of talent and that youth movement that ended up with Canada now being one of, if not the second strongest, basketball nation on the planet. I think people have recognized it enough now where it's going to be officially recognized in some capacity this season in Toronto, whether that's his jersey retirement, whether that's some other way, whether it's a statue, whether it's everything. But for me, there's got to be, even if it's it should be bigger than a garden gnome, but even if it's not like a full size statue, there's got to be a statue of Vince with the ball between his legs going up for that most memorable dunk from his 2000 dunk contest performance. And I think that's kind of like the way to bring it all full circle with him and really kind of put a bow on his story in Toronto, whether we're talking the good, the bad, or the ugly.
That's a great one. That's actually there's so many guys from the early 2000s that just like culturally mean so much. Like Allen Iverson, I think historically, even as a Sixers fan, I could say this gets a little bit overrated in terms of the level of player he was. But if you were around during that time, Carter, T-Mac, Iverson, what they meant to us when we were growing up, like it's literally like you can't replace that. Like you can't replace the memories that those guys provided in the early 2000s, especially during an era that was so slow, the dead ball era where there wasn't a ton of scoring and it wasn't quite as exciting as the game would become years later. Those guys just stand out so much in my mind. That's a really good answer.
Yeah, I think Timmy D and Vince are both worthy in their own ways in those respective cities. But I'm with you that Muscala needs one first. If Tyrese Maxey plays a big hand in the Sixers winning their first championship since '83, then Muscala, give him a ring or something for that seemingly meaningless shot helping deliver the Sixers Tyrese Maxey.
Yeah, he only played half a season for us, but he means so much to me.
Yeah. He means the world, and I understand it. All right, Trill, man, always fun talking to you. Thank you so much for doing this. Let our viewers and listeners know where they can find your work.
Yeah, so you can check out my stuff on our Patreon, Ball Patreon, YouTube. Those are generally the places. Then everywhere you find your podcast, you can follow me at Trill Bro Dude on X. Not Twitter, no. In all seriousness, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So we basically do kind of, similar stuff to what we talked about today. We also do our main stuff is the slop, the trade deadline. We talk a ton about NBA media in general. So if you enjoyed this, check it out.
Yeah, and no one covers the slop, the NBA trade and rumor slop like Trill. That's why they literally call him the Slop Father. Much thanks to Trill for joining us. Thanks to everyone in the control room. Thank you to you all for listening and watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. For Trill Bro Dude, I'm Joseph Casciaro. This has been the Unfiltered Show, and we'll see you next time.